Okay, we're continuing with this book here, The Hidden History of Nutrition, Health, and Science by me, Pete Rogers. And this is part 7. And we're talking about high blood pressure. In particular, we're going to be talking about the book by Richard Moore. He's an MD, PhD. The book's called The High Blood Pressure Solution. He spent, his entire career working on hypertension. And there's really two parts to hypertension. First of all, let's explain the conventional position. Conventional medicine on the subject of hypertension is completely stupid. It's a disgrace. It's evil. They've been teaching this back since before I was in medical school, 35 years ago, 40 years ago. They tell the students 95% of hypertension is idiopathic, meaning the doctor's an idiot and the patient's pathetic, of unknown cause, also called essential hypertension. Therefore, why don't you take our pill, try to slow it down. So they always act like they're magnanimous, they're good, they're trying to help this poor patient. It's sad, the patient's has hypertension, nobody knows why. Maybe it's racism, maybe it's socioeconomic disparity. Oh, bullshit. The answer is obvious. First of all, let's talk about what hypertension is. You have to pump, normal blood pressure is to pump blood to the top of your brain, your cerebral cortex, okay? You have to pump the blood against gravity, so you need to pump the blood under pressure. Well, guess what? If you eat a high-fat diet, it sticks the red blood cells together. LDL cholesterol, chylomicrons have a positive charge that overcomes the zeta potential, and it will stick the red blood cells together, and that will make the blood thicker. It'll become like a milkshake. Instead of pumping normal blood like water, it'll become thick blood like a milkshake. Now you're pumping thick blood, pressure has to go up. And then the person will often eat a high-salt diet. High in salt, low in potassium and magnesium, which is like a pizza is a perfect example. Real high in fat and sodium. Now, the sodium is a vasoconstrictor, inhibits endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the production of nitric oxide, the vasodilator. Nitric oxide also prevents platelets from clotting, prevents them from becoming activated, sticky. So it thins the blood a little bit, and it opens up the artery. It's a vasodilator. So that makes it easier to pump blood. But if you eat high sodium and low potassium, magnesium, like processed food is always high sodium, low potassium, magnesium, the arteries constrict. Now you're pumping that thick milkshake-like blood through constricted arteries. Pressure has to go up more. That's what causes hypertension. Okay? It's not some big mystery. The book's been lying for over 40 years. A typical study is, the C.P. Donaldson paper. He's the author, Lancet Journal, 1929. Blood pressure in the African native, 1,800 consecutive black adult men from Kenya admitted to the hospital. What percentage had hypertension? In the United States, it'd be about 80%. In Kenya, 0% where they ate a plant-based diet. 0%. None of them. That's why all this genetic stuff about hypertension is BS, okay? The reason you'll see families where everybody has hypertension is because they all eat a similar diet. All right, so anyways, what did Richard Moore figure out? He figured out that a high sodium and a low potassium diet causes hypertension. Just the problem with ions. And processed foods all is high in sodium. Here's the reason why. Inside of a cell is going to normally, in all living cells, plant, animals, is going to be high in potassium, low in sodium. Okay? But when you process a food, you grind it up typically. You rinse it with water. You rinse it with solvents. Then you add back sodium for flavor and as a preservative. It creates a localized hyperosmolality, so stuff can't grow. That's why it's a preservative. So anyways, it's always going to be high sodium and low potassium. So it's always going to be prone to causing high blood pressure. The populations that eat processed foods are fat and sick, okay? All right, so a couple more things here. This is a sodium-potassium ATP pump in a cell, meaning that it pumps out sodium and it pumps in potassium. Typically, 3 sodium go out, 2 potassium come in. So the fact that it's pumping more positive charge out than it's bringing in means that it's conducting a current, like it's electricity, okay? There's a separation of charge across the plasma membrane, okay? Stored charge, kinetic energy. You've got a gradient with negative 65 millivolts inside the plasma membrane. That's all consistent with like an electrical battery, okay? That's what the plasma membrane ion pumps are. And because you're pumping out more sodium, and you already have extracellular matrix high in sodium, you have a gradient both of electrical charge and a gradient of concentration. Okay, there's about 10 times more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. What that means is you can couple things to this gradient. If you now were to allow sodium to come into the cell, you could then pump out calcium against its gradient. So this is how the cell generates electrical energy for the plasma membrane. And there's tons of these sodium potassium ATP pumps. It's typically in a regular cell like about 1/3 of the energy of the cell goes to this pump. In a neuron, it's like 1/2 to 2/3 of the cell's energy. So whenever a cell puts that much energy into something, it's very important for the cell's life. You need magnesium because it controls the phosphates on the ATP. ATP is like a $20 bill in the cell for getting work done. It's energy currency. It means adenosine triphosphate. When it gives up a phosphate, it becomes adenosine diphosphate. Both phosphates are very charged. They want to burst away from each other. So the magnesium's double positive charge holds the phosphates together. And that's why you need potassium and magnesium inside a cell. And the potassium is part of maintaining electrochemical gradients the way they should be. Okay. So when you eat plant foods, you get the good stuff. When you eat processed food, you get the bad stuff. Okay, here's a typical cell in a little bit more detail. 10 times more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. Okay, calcium is way higher outside the cell than inside the cell. Extracellular space is basically like salt water. Salt water is high in salt and it's high in calcium. Okay, so then you just couple this electrochemical gradient to pump things whichever direction you want. Okay, we're almost done with this video here. And what you want is to eat a K factor of at least 5, meaning 5 times more potassium than sodium. And a typical let's say you're talking about a processed food. Processed food is going to have way more sodium than potassium typically. They're bad. You can tell a food's highly processed if you see more sodium than potassium in it. A typical fruit can have over 100 times more potassium than sodium. A typical starch is going to be about 15 to 100 times more potassium than sodium. A typical vegetable, in the ballpark of around 10 to 20 times more potassium than sodium. So all of those things will prevent hypertension. That's why plant foods prevent hypertension. Okay, so that was the key thing to get from this video, was just that you eat a low-fat diet full of plant foods. You'll be low in fat, you'll be high in potassium and magnesium, and you won't get hypertension. Once you've already had hypertension, the arteries become calcified, there's a loss of the Wing-Kessel effect, so it can be difficult to completely reverse it, but you can prevent it, and you can certainly improve the patient's condition by that diet. So anyways, I hope you found that helpful.